your job is trying to explain to firefighters the importance of science, you do things like that to show you that science can be sexy in the fire service, and there's all kinds of things that we can learn from it, and doing all of that research with you has been an unbelievably valuable experience. Clicker. So my job is to lead a team that is dedicated to increasing the knowledge of the fire service, figuring out that science, figuring out what you do on a daily basis, and figuring out how we can better understand it so you can be more effective at the job that you need to do every day. Expanding that all the way from tactics all the way through the problem of cancer and how we understand it and what we can do about it. When we look at the fire service, we really look at it as a big system, trying to understand many of the studies you've heard about, starting with the 1950s and working its way forward. The important thing to understand here is that the firefighter's work environment is not a static thing. What our predecessors responded to over the decades is different than what we're responding to today, which leads to many different hazards. So if you just look at something as simple as a residential house fire, homes are getting larger. Today, a single-family home is 1,000 square feet larger on average than it was in the late 1970s. Open spaces. Something as simple as renovating your house and taking out walls or building houses with open floor plans make more oxygen available to a fire. When you've got more oxygen available to a fire, you're able to burn differently. So when you can burn differently, different products of combustion are created, a different environment exists, and how you interact with that environment is going to be different. Evolving fuel loads, this is a big one, especially for the cancer and exposure problem that we're trying to better understand. The things that were in our homes 50 years ago, when plastic started getting introduced in the 1950s and expanding from there into all different kinds of products from the natural materials that were there previously, does a number of things. It changes how that fire grows and spreads. It changes what you arrive to. It changes what you interact with. And of course, it changes all of those chemicals that get into the air, into that environment, that ultimately transition to you in many different ways. And we'll talk about that later. Void spaces. Pretty much if you can design it on a computer, you can build it. So as we look at how fire moves through structures, the increased void spaces change where that fire can go, what it can get into, what it exposes, and ultimately what that means to you. Changing building materials. This one's unlimited, and this is one that we are constantly keeping an eye on, and one that I'm going to show you a number of examples of. But the bottom line is the housing industry is looking for ways to be better, safer, cheaper, all of those things. And I can tell you that their number one thing they're not thinking of as they change those building materials is, what might this mean to the fire service when they respond to this call next week? That's not at the top of the list. But we need to pay attention to that because there's a number of things that we've seen in the past, things like lightweight construction and others, that become serious acute hazards to your work environment. And working with IAFF and folks like Sean DeCrane, we were able to get code changes put in place that can buy you that extra time. So the chance of falling through a floor the moment you go through a front door of a house is a little less today than it has been, even though the construction is changing and working against you. And of course, all kinds of new technologies. This works for us, this works against us across the board, and we've got to be cognizant of all these changes because we're not fighting our grandfather's fire anymore. End of the day, you add all these things up, you begin to look at them and how they interact with each other. One of these might be on the next fire you go to, or all of them might be present on the next fire you go to, but you got to understand what they mean to you and the public that you serve. Ultimately, we're looking at faster fire propagation. What you arrive to is very different than what you arrived to in the past. Shorter times to flashover, which again, changes the combustion, changes the products that are put into that environment. Rapid changes in fire dynamics. When you execute a tactic, the result of that is going to start happening faster. And are we ready for that? Are we coordinated enough so we're ahead of that curve? Shorter escape times. People have less time to get out of their home. You are needed more than ever to make sure that they get out of that home safely. Shorter times to collapse, we talked about with the changing building materials. And then really the one for this summit, new and unknown hazards and exposures. We don't fully understand all of the chemicals out there and all of the impacts they have, let alone burning them. Completely change their chemical makeup. So here's a short video that kind of drives the changes of the evolving fuel load home. In our laboratory in Northbrook, Illinois, we were doing a simple demonstration. We put one room with natural materials, something that you would commonly find 60s, 70s, into the 80s, a cotton-filled sofa, and countered that with something that you would find in every single one of the homes that you respond to today, which are your synthetic fuels, your polyurethane foam-filled sofa, your synthetic carpets, synthetic curtains, everything that you would see today. And I want you to look at this from two lenses. One, what's happening before I get there, from a fire dynamic standpoint. And two, look at the amount of unburned fuel or smoke coming out of that room. And then look at the natural room. White wispy smoke, more complete combustion because we're burning natural materials, but a much slower developing fire. It eventually does get to flashover, but ultimately we're looking at almost 30 minutes before it does. I would bet that today, if you responded to that fire, I would hope you would have deployed hose line in place, water on the fire before that got to flashover. You're not doing that in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. So you're dealing at a different stage in that fire with very different hazards. And some of you would say, well, we've had these upholstered furnishings in our home for 30 years. Foam is not new. Well, it continues to evolve. And here's a perfect example that we came across as we were doing a fire investigation study. During this study, we ordered a number of chairs, thinking that we would get a wood frame, upholstered furniture, polyurethane foam chair that anyone would have in their home. At the end of the test, there was nothing that looked like a chair left. It's like, what's going on here? This also feels pretty light. Well, the frame of this chair was made of polystyrene or styrofoam type material. There was one little piece of wood in the seat, one little piece of wood in the base. All of that chair was styrofoam coated in polyurethane foam. There wasn't a tag on that thing that said that that's what it was, because it's not required. Typically, what the frame of the chair is made of is not required to be on the tag, because it was assumed to be maybe wood or metal springs or whatever the case is. Not today. But it makes perfect sense. You go and order a chair on the internet, and it gets delivered to your house. One of the important costs in that delivery is the weight. So if they can take the weight of the chair down, but still make it structurally sound so you can sit on it and it's comfortable, they're saving money and hopefully passing that savings along to you. In the fire environment, not so much. Evolving building materials. Concrete's not even concrete anymore. Our last set of tests that we were looking at basement fires, we ordered cement board. What showed up on our job site was cement board, but if you cut into it, you quickly saw that it was full of expanded polystyrene. They're trying to make the material lighter. So what does that mean to you? Well, what would be normally off-gassing water vapor is now, as you combust it, is going to be off-gassing the products of combustion of polystyrene, which are very different and a heck of a lot more impact. And I'm no expert in toxicology or industrial hygiene. That's why Kenny's going to follow me and tell you about those things. But it's very different, and there's a lot of different hazards there. The outside of structures went from maybe wood in fiberglass insulation to now foam board and vinyl siding, which again, serve many important purposes and are things that you probably want on your home. But when it starts talking about getting these things involved in the fire, especially things like this, where you may be outside the structure doing a 360. No SCBA on yet as you do your 360, you're being exposed to the products of combustion of these different materials that used to be there than 50, 60 years ago. So it's important that we understand the evolution. Spray foam is starting to become very popular as all of these environmental benefits of having an insulated home are extremely important. Except for your work environment, when it starts to get involved in the fire and the game changes. We need to understand how all these things play off of each other, as well as wood. Wood is not wood anymore. So you start talking about natural materials. Well, now it's natural materials bound together by a resin. What's in that resin? Well, in many cases, it could be polyurethane-based, in which case the products of combustion that come off of that are very different than they used to be. Does it mean they're going to go away? No. Does it mean we need to understand what they are and what that means to the hazard that you are faced with and how we protect you properly? Absolutely. Here's an example of a spray foam attic on fire in an experiment that we did. And I show this to you for several reasons. One, the cool fire dynamics and what that might mean to your operation. But two, the products of combustion that come off of this. Look at the color, look at the velocity, look at the density of it. It's not thick black smoke. It's actually kind of a whitish, light gray. You would think that maybe water's on that fire. We had pre-cut a 4x4 hole in that roof, and a 3/4 inch sheet of OSB was holding that hole closed. And this fire created enough pressure to push that and lift that board to get oxygen to burn, and ultimately began to put itself out. No water went on that fire. You're just watching the fire triangle in action right there. But again, very different fire behavior than you would have seen in the past. Very different potential result if you wind up in that house, hooking that ceiling to provide that fire oxygen, and the resultant exposure and the reading of the smoke that's going to give you those size-up clues to make you understand what level of protection you need and what tactics you're going to use, not the way they used to be. So we start looking at these ideal models. And the reality is, from a fire dynamics perspective, we've been looking at fire growth incorrectly for a long time, especially with the introduction of these synthetic materials into your work environment. The ideal model that's fuel controlled is pretty much replicating what we've been taught for a long time, which is the model of a campfire. So if you took a fuel load, put it out in your backyard, and lit it on fire, you would see fire growth. That fire would eventually get fully developed because it has all the oxygen that it wants to burn, and then it would decay and it would go out. Your reality is that second model right there, which takes into account putting that fuel load in a structure and showing the importance of the oxygen leg of the fire triangle. In this house fire that you go to, as you saw in that video earlier, there is plenty of fuel available, which is able to produce plenty of heat, but there's a limited supply of oxygen. What that does is it changes how that fire burns. It changes the products of combustion, and it changes how it's going to react once you provide that fire oxygen. This ventilation-limited fire is producing all kinds of unburned products of combustion that mean different things to your exposure, and the amount of them is going to change dramatically because you're bottling up what that fire wants to do and potentially burn clean, and you're essentially blocking the chimney and getting incomplete combustion, which is a major hazard. It also means a lot to your tactics. If that fire is looking for oxygen and you give it that oxygen, you better be ready for what the resultant fire dynamics is going to be and choose your tactics appropriately. These products of combustion have also changed dramatically. Again, I'm not going to put chemical formulas up here because I don't know that I understand them all. Again, that's what I have Dr. Fent for. But if you look at this simple comparison right here, what we're looking at is an item on fire. So today, our items on fire are producing a whole lot of incomplete combustion, even when they have oxygen all around them. You go ahead and put that product into a structure, and you get that underventilated fire, you're now looking at the products of combustion that are coming off of a room and contents fire. And now, with all of the combustibles that we have on our structures, you now have a holistic house products of combustion issue where even with oxygen available, look at the amount of soot there. That soot is unburned fuel. That unburned fuel is something that you need to be aware of. It's also full of all kinds of hazardous chemicals that are in the products made of chemicals. They combust, and what that produces, we don't even fully understand. So here's a simple table comparing three things that you're familiar with. Methane, natural gas, burns very clean. So you can see here it produces no CO, no soot, no unburned hydrocarbons. Then we get to something like a natural fuel, red oak. You get a level above that for CO, soot, and unburned hydrocarbons. And then we go to polystyrene. And you're looking at more than a factor of 10 increase in carbon monoxide production, soot production, as well as unburned hydrocarbon production. When you saw the video earlier that had the soot and the particles being transferred and moving throughout your work environment and your life, our studies have seen that for a given particle size, you're looking at more than a 12% or 12-time increase in the number of particles when you burn synthetic fuels versus burning natural fuels. And I challenge you to find a lot of natural fuels in your work environment these days. Everything's being moved to a synthetic component of some sort. So here it is. Here's a quick time of reflection. So if we look at your workplace, if we look at the fires you're going to go to when you leave here and go back to your communities, here's the facts, right? Houses are getting larger. Fuel loads are changing, resulting in ventilation-limited conditions. Home designs are less compartmented, open, more oxygen to burn, able to produce larger fires with larger fuel loads, with energy efficiency being built into them, whether it's house wraps or windows or foam. Evolutions in building materials are changing faster than we can understand them from a research perspective, and much faster than the codes are able to keep up with them. In many cases, we're reactive to things that happen, and we go back and try and catch up to them and change them because they negatively impact your safety. Chemicals are being used that have unknown health implications. And how they change once they burn, in many cases, we don't even know, we don't understand. So how does that impact you? We're trying to figure it out, and we're trying to catch up. A number of acute hazards that can kill you immediately, a number of chronic hazards that can kill you over time. So with these facts, ask yourself, have your staffing, has your training, have your tactics, have your policies and protocols changed to adapt to all of those changes? Think about that. In many cases, it might be yes, and in many cases, you might not even know what these hazards are. But we've got to understand them, we've got to start wrapping our heads around them, and ultimately we have to evolve because our work environment is evolving. So that's my world, looking at your workplace, looking at kind of the front end of this complex cancer problem. And like many of the presenters before me, this is where partnerships become extremely important. This is where our knowledge begins to stop. But your questions don't stop there. So the project that I'm going to tell you about right now and introduce what the next two speakers are going to build upon is this partnership led by Dr. Horn at the Illinois Fire Service Institute, bringing in the expertise of NIOSH, University of Illinois at Chicago, Skidmore College, Globe, the funding from the AFG program that is so critical to much of this research to get these answers because it's not cheap and it's not easy. But it takes groups like this. And then the group that kind of sits on top of this is the fire service, because we're not getting any of this done if it's not with the fire service. We're not doing anything for you, we're doing it with you. And representatives from all of your organizations, from many of your departments, are sitting at the table making sure that what comes out of this is relevant to what matters to you. So have a look at this study.
In order to look at the carcinogenic and cardiovascular risks that firefighters are facing, we've designed an experiment in which we asked 36 firefighters to actually come to the Fire Service Institute and do real firefighting in a modern fire environment.
It's one of the first times we're able to bring together the great research that's been done at the Illinois Fire Service Institute, working on the cardiovascular strain of firefighting, with our partners at the Underwriter Labs and NIOSH.
Before firefighters engage in the firefighting activities, we get complete physiological measures. We then put them into the firefighting situation, and we measure all of those things again, the blood, the breath, and the urine, as well as the continuous monitoring of heart rate, EKG, and core temperature. And what this allows us to do is better understand the overall physiological strain, but also to understand how the tactics and what they're doing on fire ground impacts physiology and exposure risk.
So there's a number of components that become important here, right? Looking at how complex firefighting is. There's the fire dynamics component. There's the what you arrive to and how you interact with the component. And then we've got the thermal and cardiovascular strain that your body is going through as you perform your job. And then the resultant chemical exposures that become a part of that are all lumped together into this series of experiments, and we've got experts that tackle each one of those phases to make sure that we're getting the best bang for the buck and learning as much as we possibly can to give you the knowledge you need to hopefully make your job better. So we look at this firefighting and our resultants that we're trying to limit and reduce. Want to put down the cancer, put down the sudden cardiac events. And then we start with, again, your environment, where you work, the products of combustion that get produced, the heat that gets produced. And we start looking at this, as Gavin will put it, from a farm-to-table approach. What's in the materials, in the structure, they will burn. They get released into the environment as toxic gas and particulates. You have dermal exposure. And then on the heat side, you get the heat that's produced by the fire. Then you've got that heat transfers to your PPE. And then it influences your skin and core temperature, all of which are vital components to understanding how it impacts you as the firefighter. None of these components live together. They all feed off of each other. And in many cases, think of as you heat up, how you sweat changes, how chemicals are absorbed into your skin changes. So we've got to look at this as a full system. How your heart works once your core temperature increases, building on all of the great work that Gavin Horn and Denise have been working on for some time, and adding in all of the things of how do we get it from the furniture to the smoke to the firefighter and out in their urine or measure it in their blood to understand those pathways that are so important to protect you to figure out how we limit cancer. We also have the recovery component here as it looks for sudden cardiac events. 2 hours post, 6 hours post, 12 hours post. What is still in your body and what might that mean? What is your core temperature doing and what might that mean to your health? Then we've got the decon piece from a particulate standpoint. How do we control that? How do we do that properly? And then the skin cleaning. How do we get it off? What still goes in? What doesn't make it in? And then all the variables of riding position. Dr. Burgess talked about the pump operator. What about the incident commander? What if you're fire attack versus search? What if you're doing outside ventilation? What if you're on the roof? All of these different exposures mean different things, and we want to study all of those to get you the right information, and of course the tactics. If you go through the front door, if you force the door, if you rent a window, what does all of that mean to your exposure? I can only touch the tip of the iceberg with all of this, and thank God I've got my two colleagues after me to share a lot of the important information. But please care enough to go to these two locations when you get back and send these to your firefighters, because these two websites, ulfirefightersafety.org, as well as the IFSI's toolkit, will give you all of that in-depth information, because your folks are going to have questions, and this will get you those answers. Thank you.